So today is the ACT workshop 2 in a 3-part series. Our next workshop will be after the week of 4th of July. We won't have a workshop that week, but we'll be picking it up the week after. Again, today we're going to be looking at the ACT 2019 to 2020 practice test. So our first session, we covered a lot of the calculator strategies and things that you could do in your graphing calculator just to make your life a little bit easier on the ACT. Today, we're going to be looking at more specific questions. So I'm going to be diving a little bit deeper into the reading section, English section, science section, and math section. One of the challenging things about the ACT is that there are several sections, right? The benefit for you, though, with the fact that there are so many sections, is that each section isn't weighted as much as it would be on the SAT. So let's say you really struggle with reading. On the SAT, that's going to be a little bit bigger of a deal because your verbal score is going to make up half of your total score. On the ACT, it's just 1/4 for the reading section. So if you are really struggling on one section in particular, it's not as big of a deal on the ACT than it would be on the SAT. So don't stress out as much about it as you maybe would for the SAT. I'm not saying just blow it off and don't worry about it, just saying it shouldn't be a cause of anxiety for you. Starting this fall, the ACT will also let you retake one section at a time, which is kind of a game changer. So I had a student recently that was doing amazingly well on all of the sections of the ACT except for one section. So the student's score really improved in all of the sections, and they were just super happy with how they were doing, except for that one section. And when they took the ACT in June, it was a similar experience. After the test, the student felt great about all of those sections except the one, but they know that starting this fall, starting in September, they can go and retake just that one section. So they still went and took the test, gave it their all, so that they can get those other sections out of the way. And then for future test prep, just really emphasize and worry about that one section instead of having to look at all the other ones over again. So that's a really nice thing that the ACT is doing for students this fall. Okay, let me see. I had a couple more responses here. If you are just joining now, I had asked a question earlier so that you guys can just send me a message in the chat about what your goal score is and if you've taken the ACT before, either a real test or a practice test, how you did on that. Okay, so for today, we are going into the ACT 2019 to 2020 practice test. We're gonna look at each section individually. So for reading, let's look at that one first. And I just wanna make sure that no one has submitted any questions yet? Nobody has. This has never happened before where nobody submits a question, but it's kind of fun too, because then I'll just pick out the questions that I most frequently have to teach to students. So I think everybody raise your hand if this is your first workshop with me ever, like first workshop boot camp, you've never seen me before in your life. Everybody's seen it before. Okay, so I don't need to do an introduction. So let's see here. I'm going to pull up the ACT. And for the reading section, that's the one section I want to look at first today. And let me just launch a quick quiz for the reading section, quick little poll/quiz. And you can look through that while I pull up this test. Where are we? Here we go. Always scroll to the section before sharing my screen so that I don't make you guys a little bit dizzy with it. Okay. Almost everybody's voted. Let's see here. couple more seconds. Two more people I'm waiting on to submit their answers. Don't overthink these questions. I'm not going to share who put what answer. So these questions are mainly for me to gauge how much you already know about this section. I'm not going to be sharing your score or giving you a grade. So don't think too deeply. Just put whichever answer pops in your head first. Okay, so the first question on here is, should you skim or read the passages? And here, everybody has voted, so I'll share the results so you can look at them as we go over these questions. So you should really be either skimming the passages or reading them, as long as you are a super fast reader. So I fall in the super fast reading category. So when I am reading super fast, it's pretty much at the same speed as when most students would skim a passage. There is not enough time in the reading section to read these passages carefully and then go to the questions. There's just not enough time. And another thing for the reading section is that most of these questions reference specific parts of the passage. So they're going to ask you to go look and locate a specific answer that's mentioned somewhere in the passage. And you're not going to have time to go and hunt for that answer if you spend all your time just reading the passage. And more than likely, unless, does anybody raise your hand if you have a photographic memory? Does anybody have a photographic memory? Where you just 100% retain everything that you ever see? And nobody. So the likelihood that you are going to be able to retain everything that you just read to the point where you can accurately answer questions without looking back is extremely low. There are very few students that I've met that are able to do that. So what does that mean for you? It means that you want to get through the passage as quickly as possible. You want to skim it or read it if you can read really, really quickly. Whoops, there goes my cap. And you're just going to be looking, so you're going to skim and look for the main idea and the tone. Is the author positive, negative, or neutral about it? What is the passage about? Just the main idea. You don't want to get into the nitty-gritty details. So as I'm skimming, does anybody know, and you can put it in the chat box, what are my speed bumps when I'm skimming? When do I pay attention and I slow down just slightly? I'm going to see if anybody knows that's joining me today. So as I'm skimming, what am I looking for? Yes, Reagan. So I'm looking for a but or an and, or a but or however, although, despite. I'm looking for some kind of word of contrast that indicates there's a shift in whatever's being said by the author. Not every single passage on the ACT will utilize the word but, however, although, despite. Not every single passage will utilize those words of contrast. Sometimes you'll just see the word not. But if they are using those words of contrast, they are going to be gifts to you. It's just going to make the passage 10 times easier, so you want to pay attention to them. If you don't see it in a passage on the ACT, every now and then I'll come across a passage that doesn't really use those words. I don't freak out. I just slow down and think, okay, is there anything else that's unusual that maybe is occurring in this particular passage? So let's say there are only a couple things inside of quotations. It's not a dialogue for the whole passage. That means we want to pay extra special attention to those quotes. Same thing for if you see dashes or semicolons. I put them in the strange punctuation category. You want to pay attention to them. Any words that are italicized for emphasis, you want to pay attention to. So if I have a passage and it's all dialogue and there are just a ton of quotes, I'm not going to slow down for every single quote, right? Because there are just a ton of quotes. Same thing for if I just see dashes all over the place, I'm not going to be as interested in them. But if I notice, I only have dashes here or there, I have my words of contrast, there's just one or two quotes, then I'm going to pay attention. So we're going to skim and we're going to find our main idea and our tone. So there's something else that you can do when you first get your reading test. So I asked you guys, do you know what previewing a section means? And 6 of you said yes, and 3 of you said no. So previewing a section means as soon as you get your test, you're going to page through and just kind of look at the first sentence or the title of every single passage and see if there's one that really interests you that maybe you want to do first, or see if there's one that looks really icky and you can just star it as, hey, I need to do this passage last. So we kind of want to eat dessert first on the ACT, especially for the reading test, because the likelihood that you're going to run out of time on testing is extremely high. So I do want you to, of course, take practice tests and improve your speed and get faster at it. But I have found even some of the best test takers, so I'm talking about students that are scoring 34 plus on the ACT reading, sometimes have a really hard time finishing the reading test within the 35 minutes. So things like just bubbling in your answers on test day will take a little bit of extra time if you find that you're re-skimming a section or you're getting stuck or you get distracted for a second and you have to start over. All of those things can kind of steal time away from you. So it's super important for you to start with passages that you think will be easier for you or you're more interested in. So if I'm interested in something, I'm going to retain more information. I'm going to engage more with that passage. It's going to take a lot less effort for me to remember what I just read. So let's say I am reading a magazine article about traveling to Paris. And I love going to Paris. And I'm reading that article and I find it interesting. I'm going to remember what that author says about Paris. I'm going to know, does the author like Paris or hate Paris? What was the main idea of the article? Was it about finding a hotel there or finding restaurants or tourist attractions? Or was it just about living in Paris? So I am going to retain that really easily. If I am reading an article in a magazine about cars, I'm not extremely interested in cars at all. To me, if I see a car go by, it's just a silver SUV or a black SUV. I don't really differentiate between, is the car 10 years old or 20 years old? Is it a luxury brand or not? So if I'm reading an article about cars, it's not extremely interesting to me. So it's going to be a lot harder for me to really pay attention to it, engage with it, and remember what I just read. So that would be something that I would save for last, right? So we want to eat dessert first, do whatever is easier for you, whatever you're more interested in, and go pick up those points first. The last thing that you want to happen to you on an ACT reading test is for you to get stuck on a super icky passage. For me, it will usually be those passages that deal with astronomy. I'm not super interested in them. So here we have passage 4 is the Milky Way is warped. I don't find that incredibly interesting. So I'm really going to have to pay attention to but, however, not, any type of speed bump that helps me know this is where I need to pay attention to. If I'm reading a passage, let's see, our first one here was about swimming. You can see that I annotated very little. I was on the swim team in high school, so if I'm reading something about swimming, I am going to pay attention a little bit easier. It's not going to be super challenging for me to read that. So I'm not going to have to annotate as much. I can get through this passage really fast, see, okay, it's about someone swimming. was a really important moment, and then I can go hunt for that information. So that's what I mean by previewing a section, making sure that whichever passages you like better, you do first. So every now and then you may come across a test where you don't like any of the passages. They're just all awful and you don't want to deal with them. And in that case, I kind of fake interest. So this is a mental game. I hope you can bear with me and understand what I'm about to say. But let's say that you are about to have an interview for your dream job, or you're having dinner with your friend's parents and you want them to like you, and your interviewer or your friend's parents are telling you a really boring story, but you need to pay attention because sooner or later they are going to stop talking, and then you need to say something that makes it seem as if you are paying attention. And just reciting back whatever the last sentence was that they said is not going to make it look like you were paying attention. They're going to think, oh, they really weren't that interested. They were bored by me. So in that case, I would fake interest. And as the person is talking, or as I'm reading a really boring passage, I will come up with questions that I could ask. So let's say we are reading, I'm just going to use this astronomy or this Milky Way passage because it's my least favorite in this section. So let's say I am skimming and I see, oh, this galaxy was discovered in 1994. There's a roughly polar orbit around the Milky Way. And then I would think, okay, do other galaxies have different kinds of orbits? If I'm reading here or skimming in line 49, gravitational collisions between small satellite galaxies and big spiral galaxies, and then think, are there different kinds of collisions or only gravitational collisions? So something that just makes it seem as if you're paying attention, you're engaging, and you're interested in the topic. So that's what I mean by faking interest. If that makes sense to everybody, just raise your hand if that kind of makes sense. So you're faking being interested, and then by doing so, you are engaging more with the passage too. So it's really interesting how that happens. So probably like a decade ago when I was teaching the ACT, I would always use the example of pretend you're meeting Justin Bieber and he is telling you something, a really boring story, and you have to engage. But I can't really use that example anymore because he's not as popular as he was 10 years ago. Okay, let's see here. So we went over what previewing a section means. What about answering the passages in order? So this kind of goes with previewing the section, right? So if I am previewing the section and I decide there's a certain passage that I want to skip or a certain passage that I want to do first, that means that I am not going to be answering those passages in order. Answering the questions in order, that's another thing that I'm not going to do. So there are certain questions, let's see here. Number one, the narrator of the passage can be best described as a swimmer who primarily does what? So this is a main idea question. I'm not going to necessarily find a sentence in the passage that gives me the answer. So that's a question that I would save for the end. I wouldn't answer this first, so save for last. But then if we look at, let's say, question number 8 here, the statement, that's where you're going now, hurry up. They're giving me a specific line reference. So I can just go and read before and after that specific line and figure out the answer. So that would be a type of question that I'm going to prioritize to do first. Because as I'm answering question 8, let's see if there's another. Question 6 also gives me a specific line reference. As I'm answering those, I am becoming more acquainted with the passage because remember, at first I just skimmed the passage. So I have an idea of what's going on, but I don't really know the details. So this is directing me to all of the important details so that I can understand the passage a little bit more. And then when I answer question number 1 last, I am better qualified to answer question number 1, and I'm not re-skimming the entire passage. There's another thing that can be kind of interesting with these passages. So if I am answering question number 9, so for the narrator, compared to practicing in the outdoor pool, practicing in the indoor pool is what? So I am always going to kind of skim in reverse. So depending on where I am in the question. So if I need to just go find a detail, if I'm finding a detail for one of the first questions, let's say we're at question number 3 here, I'm going to look towards the beginning of the passage first. And if I am answering one of the final questions, let's say question number 6 here, or 9, where they don't give me line references, but I need to go find those answers, I am going to go from the end of the passage and skim backwards to the beginning. It's not 100% of the time where the first questions deal with the first part of the passage, but it is a lot of the time. So it's worthwhile to just change the direction that you are looking for an answer based on what the question number is for that passage. So let's see here. So we went over, should we answer the passages in order or the questions in order? We also want to do something for questions that don't give us a specific line reference. We want to look for some type of keyword in the question stem that we can go look for. And if you are struggling with reading, this is something that you're going to want to go back and do for every single passage after you've already taken the test or during the test, to just really refine that skill, because this is something that you can get better at, kind of like if you're playing a Scrabble or Sudoku or a game on your phone. It's something that you're just, does anybody here play Candy Crush? Let's see if we have anybody who's played Candy Crush in their lives. Yeah, we've got 1, 2, 3. Yeah, so it's something that you're gonna get better at the more you do it. So it's the same thing for when you're identifying the word, you're gonna learn which are going to be the words that you look for first. So let's try it on question number 3. Which word in this question stem, and the question stem is just the question, which word in here would be the best word to go and skim for to try to find this answer in the passage? What's the word that I'm going to look for? You can just put it in the chat box if you know. What is the most important word in there? It's going to be the natatorium, right? So this is a word that is kind of unusual. I swim on a high school swim team, and I'm not even really sure what a natatorium is. So whatever's the strangest word and you think is going to appear less frequently is the word that you're going to look for, and you're going to look in that vicinity around it. You're not going to fall into the trap of just looking at that single word. So let's look at line 24 is what I marked it as here. So here we have the natatorium, and I would always look before and after. So by the time I stood up on the blocks, I was not only the only one in the race, I was practically the only one in the natatorium. So that would be the easiest one to look for. You could, so Kay said, look for spectators. You could also look for spectators, but spectators is a little bit more common of a word than natatorium. So you may find that you see spectators more than once. I'm not sure if that's true for this passage, but that's what I would expect. And that's kind of the skill you can get better at, is just identifying what is the word I'm looking for and then getting really fast at locating it. So here too, number 4, what would we look for in number 4? What's our key word in number 4? What are we skimming for? I'll give you guys a second. Oops. Give you guys a second. Okay, so we would look for the 1,000-yard freestyle, right? Or the world, right? Something about the world. But when we look at where the answer is for this in 3738, we see here that it's actually the world. If we first looked at where he talked about, oops, what was that? The 1,000-yard freestyle, that's up here. And when we find that, we would see it says nothing about the world right at that point. So it is possible that the first thing you identify doesn't give you the answer. And then you find your second word inside of the question stem and go look for where that is mentioned in the passage. And that's really a key skill that you can refine to improve your ACT reading. So remember, we can skim a passage or read it really quickly, look for our main idea and our tone by looking for words of contrast like but, however, although, despite, looking at punctuation like dashes or semicolons or quotes, anything italicized if it's not all over the passage. Of course, if we have a ton of dashes, ton of quotes, ton of things italicized, then they become less important in that passage. And then we can also kind of preview a section, right? Decide which questions or which passage we're going to answer first or which one we're going to save for last. And also figure out what order we're going to answer the questions in. So there are some students that really dislike previewing a passage and answering the questions out of order. So some students really like going in order, so answering the first passage and then the second passage, third passage, and so forth. And it just throws them off if they go out of order. Same thing for questions. If that is you and you get really uncomfortable with it, it's better for you to just answer those passages in order and questions in order. This is also a strategy that you want to try out on practice tests first. So it's not enough to just listen to me tell you these things and not put it in action and refine that skill, right? So you want to really get comfy with it and see if it works for you and see if you can improve with it before test day and not leave test day as your trial run. Usually when we are taking the actual test, our adrenaline is kind of pumping, we're a little bit nervous, and that's a really bad time to try something out the first time, because 9 times out of 10, we will revert to whatever we did before. We're not going to try something new. Okay, so for reading, do we have any specific questions for the reading section? Did anybody take this test, have any questions? If not, we're gonna move on to another section. But I wanted to make sure we covered some reading basics today. Give you guys a second here. Let's see. Oh, I did have a couple of reading questions submitted here. Let's look at some of them. So number 5 was a question. The passage indicates that during the narrator's swim at the time trial, he understood for the first time that what? So first off, question number 5 is kind of in the middle, right, of this question set. So when I'm skimming for it, I am going to be skimming, and I'm going to get like a really big highlighter here so you can see. I'm going to be skimming in the middle here. I'm not going to be skimming in the beginning or the end. I'm first just going to start in the middle because it's question number 5. It's kind of a couple of questions in. And let's see where the answer is here. So the answer that I found was in 72 to 73. And we can see here the word, what I understood, not later, but right in the water, was how little the swim added up to in the world. So we can see there are a lot of clues right around this line reference, right? So first, let's look over here. We have our keyword is understood, right, for the first time. So that's what I would have been skimming for, is the word understood. And we see that pops up not just right where the dashes are, and remember I said dashes are super important, but also right in the vicinity of the word but, which is our most important word of contrast. And once you start paying attention to punctuation and those words of contrast, you will note that this happens all the time, which is why we want to slow down when we come across those questions. So for this one, he understood how little the swim added up to in the world, right? And then we're always looking a little bit before and after. We're not just looking right at where we found whatever word we skimmed for. So if I look a little after here, it says, it mattered because it was a task before me now. If no one else cared, then the swim was mine alone, right? It only mattered to him. So then it becomes more obvious what the answer is. And you will note, so here the answer is C. This one was an event that was important to him alone. I should be able to formulate an answer on my own before looking at those answer choices and then pick an answer choice that matches what I said. So on the ACT, we don't ever want to force answers. This is extremely important. So if you are finding the information in the passage and you come up with an answer and then you look at the answer choices and none of them match yours, don't pick the one that just best matches it. Go back and make sure that you actually found the right part of the passage and that you actually fully understood the question. So reread the question before picking an answer choice that is kind of a forced fit to whatever you found. So the ACT reading is really nice in that most of the time the answers will be verbatim in the passage. That means word for word, directly stated in there. So it's just a matter of finding it. So you shouldn't really have to force anything. It's not how do you interpret the information. That would be more on the SAT sometimes. We have to pick the best answer. We have to pick something that closely matches what was in the passage, but isn't necessarily word for word what was in the passage. Whereas on the ACT, a lot of time it will be word for word in the passage, and that is a really important distinction between the SAT and the ACT. Let's look at one more question here. So for the narrator, compared to practicing in the outdoor pool, practicing in the indoor pool is what? So I would be looking in that passage for the word outdoor or indoor, right? And let's look at line 48. I think that's around where I found it. Ooh, and here we can see outdoor pool, right? And remember, we're looking before and after. We're not just looking at the sentence where we found that. So that morning swimming, I remember the day in late September, the year before, the last day my swim had use of an outdoor pool. All summer long, my teammates and I swam under an open sky. After this day, we would spend the rest of the season in a dank and moldy indoor pool. So this is where we can use the tone, right? He is pretty negative about the indoor pool, and he is pretty positive about that outdoor pool. So we want something that's going to say that the indoor pool is positive, and so the indoor pool is positive, and the outdoor pool is negative. So we want something that indicates that he doesn't like that outdoor pool, right? So for the narrator, compared to practicing in the outdoor pool, the indoor pool, oh, I swapped these. Sorry, guys. Did anybody catch that? If you catch me making a silly mistake, tell me. So the indoor pool is the moldy one. So this one should be negative, and the outdoor pool is the positive one. So the indoor pool needs to be something negative, which would be less appealing. That would be the most negative answer choice that fits the information that we found in the passage. Okay, let's go on to another section. I want to see if any English questions were submitted to me, and there were a couple. So let's first just take a peek at the English section. And you should, let me make sure that I have this for you guys. So I'm actually, we'll go in here. Let's see if you have it in your Google Drive folder. And you do. So does anybody here not have access to the Google Drive folder? Raise your hand if you don't have access to it, and I will drop the link. Okay, so everybody has access to it. If you go and click on core material, so let me, here, I will drop the link so that you guys have it. So if you go in the Google Drive folder, let me actually just share my screen here so that you can see what I see. Okay. So if I'm in here in the Google Drive folder, and if I click on core material, this is where you really want to spend some time memorizing. So there's both the grammar handout in here, and this gives examples of every grammar rule that you need to know for the ACT. Remember, if it's not in this handout, it's not on the test, and I would really take the time to carefully work through this handout and look at all the rules, look at the examples. And if you find something extra challenging, let me know before our final workshop that's in 2 weeks. And I will go over it in detail during that workshop. If you find something challenging, also highlight it or sticky note it, star it, whatever you need to do so that you know that is what you need to come back to and really review. Every time you take an ACT practice test, also note on the English section, if you miss a question, which grammar rule is applicable to that question, and note it on this handout too. So star it again. I really need to know this. I'm getting pronoun questions wrong or subject-verb agreement questions. So that's the longer handout, is this grammar handout that I just showed you guys. And it gives examples of everything. And then I also have this English core concepts handout in here. And this is a single page. So let me actually, I am going to pull it up on my iPad here. And we're going to take a look at it. Just send it to myself really quickly. Okay. Let's look at this. So this handout is only a single page, but it's really dense. So don't underestimate this one. In this handout, I simplify all the concepts that you need to know. So I don't give examples or full explanations, but it can be used as a quick review of things that you need to know for testing. Let's do a quick little poll as we start the English section here. So I'm gonna add the English one here. And remember, just vote whatever the first thing is that pops in your mind. I'm not going to share who voted for what. So you should see the poll pop up on your screen. Give you guys a couple more seconds. Couple more need to vote. While I'm waiting for the rest of you to vote, let's talk about these. So when in doubt, should you pick the longest or shortest answer choice in the English section? You're actually going to want to pick the shortest answer choice. Note that you're only using this if you're guessing or you're between two answer choices. So you're not going to go through the whole English section and just pick out all of the shortest answer choices. That would be a terrible strategy. Let me share these results with you guys. So 33% set the longest answer choice and 67% set the shortest, but we're going to pick the shortest answer choices, and that's because the English section favors answers that are concise. So they say whatever they're trying to communicate using the fewest words possible, which is why the shortest answer choices are more likely to be right. My next question on here was, which of these words should you avoid during the English section? So if you see an answer choice that contains this word, you're not going to pick it unless all the other choices are terribly wrong. They just have obvious grammatical errors, and you just have to pick the answer choice that has the word being. So the word being, and let's just highlight it on here. So we're going to avoid answer choices that are long. We're also going to avoid answer choices that contain the word being. So being is the worst offender out of all of those. So I also like avoiding answer choices that contain the words it or was or INGs, but that's not going to be 100% of the time. The word being is as close to 100% as you could possibly get. You'll never get 100% of the time that you can avoid anything, but it's extremely unlikely to be the right answer if it contains the word being, so we won't pick it. Let's see here. Do you still need to skim the parts that are not underlined? Ooh, I had a little typo on here. Sorry, guys. I meant to say that are not underlined, not or. Or can you skip over them? So you need to skim them still. You can't skip them because the ACT English section will have questions that deal with the main idea of the whole passage. When you see questions that ask you to add or delete or move a sentence, you have to understand everything in that passage. You have to have some idea of what the author is trying to communicate. Otherwise, you won't be able to answer those questions. So you still need to skim the parts that are not underlined, you can't just skip over them. And then my final one here is kind of a trick question. Should you preview the English section? And I would say no. I would just answer the English section passages in order. I don't really find that there are going to really be more appealing or less appealing ones. They're all pretty equal to me. If you differ and you really want to preview it, that's fine. Go right ahead. But for the most part, I see them all the same. I don't have a major preference for one English passage over the other. It's not the same as for the reading section, or even for the science section, I would also preview the section first. For the English section, I just kind of dive in. So let's look at some of the key things I want you guys to know for this English section. So we went over, we want to avoid questions that have, or we want to avoid answers that are long or contain the words it, was, being the worst, or that end in INGs. We also want to be careful of picking answers, and this is really important. I call it the 3 C's of the English section. So we want answers that are clear, concise, and consistent with the rest of the passage. So if you need a little mantra in the back of your head as you're taking the English section, this is it. It can almost unlock most of the English section. So you can ask yourself, hey, is this answer really clear? So clear would be, is it using the right pronoun, right? Or should we maybe replace that pronoun with the noun to make it more clear? Usually for the ACT, they favor answer choices that make those answers really clear, so there's no doubt what the author's trying to say. Concise would be answering using the fewest words possible, right? And then consistent with the rest of the passage. So consistency would be subject-verb agreement errors, right? So if we have a singular subject, we need a singular verb. So that would be something that deals with consistency. So subject-verb agreement. Our pronoun use would also have to be consistent. So make sure it's the correct pronoun. Let's see, our verb tense, right? It needs to be consistent. And then redundancy would be another consistency issue. Redundancy. So if it's already stated somewhere else in the passage, we don't have to say it again. So that would be something that falls under that consistency category. Parallelism also. So if we have items in a series and one of them ends in ing, then all of them need to end in ing. Or if we have 2, 2, 2, they all need to be 2, like 2 run, 2 bike, 2 swim, not 2 bike, 2 run, and swimming, right? We have to have 2, 2, 2, or ing, ing, and ing. So we need to make sure it's consistent. And when we're checking for any type of consistency issues, you can see a lot of these grammar rules fall under that heading. So just remember the phrase that you want answers that are clear, concise, and consistent with the rest of the passage. And this is going to be a handout that I'm going to leave up to you guys to really get into the nitty-gritty of. Do we have any questions on something specific on here today before we move on to our next section? And just take a peek at it. Let me see if I also had questions submitted for the English section. I think I did. So we'll look at a couple of English questions. Oh, I have 2 questions submitted. So let's look at those. So 52 and 67. Ooh, it's a good one to look at. So 52, in one study, researchers used a laser beam and advanced optical techniques to measure winds. The observatory also keeps detailed weather records that scientists have used to track climate trends and weather patterns. The observatory has also advanced scientists' understanding of clouds. So we need to see if we need to add a transition word here. So the first thing that really jumps out at me, and this is just a test-taking skill that comes naturally to others, comes naturally to some, and for others, we have to learn it. What do you notice about all of these answer choices, G, H, and J? What I notice is they're all kind of the same. In addition, additionally, also, they mean the same thing. So if I have answer choices, if I have more than one answer choice that means the same thing, it means that none of them can be the correct answer. Remember that this is a standardized test. So we could actually answer this question without really even understanding what's going on in the passage. Just remember, it's a standardized test, so there can only be one correct answer. And I can't give you an argument why in addition would be better than additionally. They mean the same thing. It's just a preference which one you want to use. It's not that one is more grammatically correct than the other one. So whenever you notice that in answer choices, it's just like a gift from the ACT to you. When you notice that more than one answer choice means the same thing, you can feel really assured that neither or none of them will be the right answer. But let's look at why G, H, and J are not right. So this is actually a redundancy issue. For 52, we have the word also here. So we would never say additionally and then also, or in addition and then also, or also as an answer choice J. We only say it one time. We don't want to restate the same thing. So 52, it's just a redundancy issue, and you really can even answer this right without even understanding that it's a redundancy issue, because all of those answer choices, G, H, and J, are pretty much equivalent. So it means that none of them can be the right answer. Let's just look for fun here. I was working with a student the other day, and he said, so after we looked at a bunch of English questions, so you're basically telling me that I just always need to pick the shortest answer choice to be right. And it's kind of true, but not really. I still want you to understand the grammar rules. I don't just want you to go and pick the shortest answer choice. But look at 53, 54, and 55. Each one of these, the right answer is the shortest answer in a row. Isn't that crazy? For each one. So if you were just going through this part and picking the shortest answers, you would have gotten 3 in a row right. But then look at 56 here, the shortest answer is not right. So you can't use this all the time, but when in doubt, definitely go for the shortest answer. That's going to be way better of a guessing strategy than just Christmas treeing this section. Let's see, I had one more English question submitted. Let's see where it is. 67. Ooh, this is a good one too. So I'm always going to read a little bit before. I'm not just looking at the underlined part, because remember, for the ACT, we want consistency, and we want to make what is underlined match what is not underlined. So we have to look at the parts that are not underlined. So I am looking at 67 here, and we're going to just go a little bit before. So McCoy invented a device that released oil while a train was in motion, substantially reducing the number of maintenance stops, had the effect of making travel more efficient. So as I read it, it sounds really bad, right? It doesn't sound grammatically right. So I would eliminate A. So something on the ACT to keep in mind is if it sounds grammatically wrong, it probably is wrong. But if it sounds right, you still need to check it to make sure that it actually is right and that you're not missing something. So harder questions will sound right, even though they contain a grammar problem, and easier questions will just sound obviously wrong. So this is a case where it just sounds wrong, and I can know it's not going to be no change. And then we look at those answer choices, and I see more than one have that ing, and I generally want to avoid ings unless I have to make them match what is not underlined. So here we have substantially, reducing, and making. So it has two consequences, right? It's substantially reduced and made travel more efficient. So reducing and making, because reducing has that ing right here, we need that ing with making. We can't just pick our shortest answer choice there, D, that doesn't have the ing, which is why those are just strategies for you to use in addition to knowing the grammar rules. They're not standalone strategies. So it would be pretty awesome if I could just teach you how to guess and you could go in and just guess your way through the whole English section, but that's not the way it works. So that's what we need to keep in mind for 67. Let's move on to the science section. And I'm going to give you a quick science quiz here. If you want to vote on that while I go pull up our science section. Almost all of you have voted. There's just a couple that still need a vote. Let's start looking at these questions. So the first one is, what is the most important part of the science section? Graphs, tables, equations, or the words in the passage? So it's going to be graphs, tables, and equations unless the passage doesn't have any of them. In that case, it would be the words in the passage. But for the most part, we want to spend most of our time on those graphs, tables, equations, making sure that we're circling, underlining, marking, really engaging with those parts. And we want to spend less time actually in the passage. Regardless of if it's a science passage that has a lot of words and graphs, tables, equations or not, I will just skim the passage really quickly to get whatever the main idea is, what is being tested here, what is going on. And I wouldn't really try to retain the details of the scientific procedure or definitions or anything like that. I would just kind of note where I can find that information so that I can go back later on and go find that information if a question asks me to. So question number 2 asked you here, should you answer the science questions in order? And it was kind of a split here. Some of you said yes and some said no. And I would not answer the science section in order. Let me pull up the science section here. So any question that directs me specifically to a particular figure or diagram or part in the passage, I am going to answer first. Those will be way easier because they're basically asking you a question and directing you to the answer. So that's going to be way easier than a question that deals with the whole experiment or doesn't give you that information. It's kind of like if I asked you a question and then I told you, hey, you can find the answer on page 5 towards the top of the page in your textbook. You're going to answer those questions first, right? Before I ask you a question about the whole book. So why did the author write this book? You would save that question for last. But if I asked you a question, hey, what happens on page 5 at the top of the page, you'd be like, ooh, it's open book. I can just open up my book and go look what happens there. It's gonna be way easier to do those first. Let's see, the next question I had on here is approximately how many science questions require outside knowledge? And let me share these two so you can see how other people voted. So probably around 2 to 3. So it's not going to be 0. That would be very unlikely. I would never say anything is impossible, but it would be extremely unlikely. Usually around 2 to 3 questions ask you something where you need to use information that wasn't in the passage. Maybe it would be something like if you put 2 magnets, the poles together, they would repel, right? Or you know that when you have a chemistry equation, you have your reactants and your products. So just science basics. It wouldn't ask you to find some advanced physics, optics equation. They wouldn't ask you to know the Doppler effect equation and be able to reproduce that. That would be extreme. But they would maybe expect you to know that there's gravity, right? That would be outside knowledge. So it's going to be pretty basic, but every now and then you do need to use outside knowledge. It won't actually be in the passage or in the graph. And that's going to be something to keep in mind too throughout the science section. Use common sense. A lot of times students will try to go find something in the passage, they can't find it, they pick an answer choice that sounds best, and then when they look back at the answer they picked, they know that conflicts with their common sense. So for example, the solid I have right here, I can't mold it, right? It has a fixed shape. The liquid inside of it, I can kind of move around. You can't see the liquid, but I can. And that's something that's just common sense. I can imagine it in my head. And that's a real ACT question in one of the science sections where you had to use outside knowledge. It was just something that had to do with solids have a fixed shape. And you can come up with that using your outside knowledge and common sense, even if you hadn't learned that yet in school. Okay, let's see. We did have a couple science questions submitted here, I think. But before we look at them, let's just look at these passages as a whole. So just like for the reading section, I would preview it first, right? So I would first look at the whole section. I kind of take a peek at each passage and see which ones I want to do first. I would do the same for the science test. So previewing can occur in 2 ways. Either you look at what's to come and then you decide your order, or you can kind of just dive in. So if this was my science test, I see passage 1 here. I think, this looks pretty straightforward to me. This graph, this table is not intimidating. So I would just dive in, look at what's going on in those graphs and table, and dive into the questions. I wouldn't necessarily look ahead, but let's see what happens with passage 2 here. There's a lot going on, but again, it looks pretty straightforward. I feel comfortable with mass, volume, density, melting point, boiling point. So this is just going to be finding the information. I'm not intimidated by it. I would just answer those questions. But now we're getting to passage 3. This is not intimidating, but there's a lot going on here, right? So here I would maybe decide, you know what, if there's a shorter passage, I'm going to do that one first and then come back to this, because there's way more information in passage 3, right, than passage 2 here. So I'm going to have to spend a lot more time answering those questions for passage 3 than passage 2. There's more information that I kind of have to wade through. What can I do though for these graphs? So let's say I am attempting passage 3 and I see these graphs, and there's something I can do here to just make my life easier for both of these graphs so that I don't make a silly mistake. What can I do here? For both of these graphs, it's just a quick thing, and it's going to greatly reduce the chance that I'm going to confuse iron with nickel or zinc. Think for a second, what could I do here? It's pretty simple. Yeah, Emma, I can label them. So I would take a second and just label these. So I don't have to look at that key more than once. I can just quickly label these and then be done with it. So really engaging with whatever is provided in your passage. And once you make a connection, writing that connection down, so your brain doesn't have to do work twice. So I look at that key, I label it, and then I'm done with that key. I don't have to look back at it because it's already labeled for me on the graph, and it's going to make it faster for me when I'm comparing those figures or answering questions on it. You can see here that I highlighted my equation, or you can also circle it. They give you an equation, you're pretty much guaranteed to get a question on it. So it's a good practice to just circle it, star it, whatever you need to do so you don't forget it's there. And then I see they have this whole procedure thing here. As I'm skimming, I would probably not even really skim that. I would just see, oh, there are steps. And if I get a question about the procedure, I would go back and read that part. But the chances that I'm going to actually retain and remember those steps are extremely low, because let's face it, we are going from one passage to the next. There's a lot of information to process, and it's just not high priority for me to remember that info. So I would just note, hey, they gave me a procedure, and then move on. Same thing with this diagram. I would just kind of note, hey, there is a diagram. I'm not going to spend a ton of time trying to figure out what went where unless a question asks me about the diagram, because as you work through these science passages, you will note they often give you extra information. They're not going to ask you questions about every single piece of information given. So why would you waste your time on something if you may not even get a question on it? For this, the most important thing is just knowing, hey, there was this reaction, there was some hydrogen gas produced. They say that several times, and that's pretty much it, right? And then they collected volumes of gas. These labels are the same. Here we have mass, here we have temperature, and you can either circle it or just write it too, really big, so you remember. Figure 1, you would go to for a mass question. Figure 2, you would go to for a temperature question. And the most common mistake students make on the science section is they look at the wrong figure or the wrong graph or the wrong table. And you can easily catch that error if you're looking for the answer in a figure and it just seems like an impossible question and you're kind of stuck and you're like, how on earth am I supposed to answer this question using this figure? Go and look at that question stem again and just make sure you're looking at the right figure. And if it still doesn't make sense, just skip the question and come back to it later. You're going to get the same point for every single question you answer. So there's no way I would want to spend a ton of time trying to figure out, let's say, question number 18 here, when I can answer question number 19 in 30 seconds. So really manage your time wisely on this. So we did have some questions submitted for the science section. One of them was question number 20. Let's look at this one. So suppose that the trial in experiment 1 with a 0.25 grams of zinc is repeated, except that the inverted graduated cylinder is replaced by inverted test tubes, each completely filled with 60 milliliters of water. Based on figure 1, how many test tubes will be needed to collect all of the gas? So experiment 1, so we need to make sure we're in experiment 1, and then so remember, and we would, even if we miss the part where it said experiment 1, let's say you didn't process that, you know they're asked, it deals with the mass, right? Because we have 0.25 grams of zinc. And when we have 0.25 grams of zinc, we have 90, a little bit more than 90 milliliters here. So if we only fill each test tube with 60 milliliters of water, we would need about a test tube and a half, right, for that volume of gas collected, which is why we would round it up to 2. So this is just looking at the graph, finding that data, circle, underline, label, super critical for this section. Passage 4 would be maybe one that a lot of students would save for last. This might be a little bit more intimidating. I find that physics passages are by far the least favorite of students. So if you feel the same way, save it for last. Something to note though, so whenever I come across a passage that looks particularly icky, so we're dealing with nuclear physics, so things that you never even really learned in school, and it just looks super intimidating, I find that usually for those passages, they will have the easiest questions that just ask you to basically go find the information in the graph. So even though I say skip some passages if they're really intimidating, I would still, before you decide, I'm just going to save this for last and skip it, just see maybe the questions aren't that bad. Like look at question number 21 here. It says, according to figure 2, the maximum positive value of Vs, and again, it would be wise to label these. So Vs, and this one's I. So Vs is just the dotted line, and the maximum value is just the peak of that curve. So it's right up here, and it's between 200 and 300 for the voltage. So we would want 250 for the voltage, right? It's right in the middle there. So that's a really easy question for kind of icky information that's given here. So definitely keep that in mind before you just think, you know what, I'm not going to look at that passage at all. And let's see, I did have a question, another one submitted here. See what it is. Ooh, the volume of runoff measured at 200 minutes in study 1 for the 4 wind speeds is best represented by which of the following graphs? So 4 wind speeds in study 1. So we would take our figure 1 from study 1. Let me just pop it, oops, in here. So we would say the volume when it's, let's look at each volume here. So the volume of runoff for the 4 wind speeds. So you can see there for 0, right? It's going, so we're looking at 0, 0.5, 1, and 2.5 milliseconds. So just at that beginning, and we can see we want a curve that kind of looks like so. We don't want where 2 are the same like this for the beginning. So we're looking here. So here we have that, here we have that, and here we have that. So the one that's closest to what I drew up there would be J. So we're just looking at what is our pattern for our information in the graph. Okay, let's move on to the math section. So I'm going to launch one more poll on here, a little quick math quiz for ACT. And while you are answering those questions, I am going to pull up some math questions on here. So first question on here is, do you get the same point for an easy question as a hard question? And yes, you do. You get the exact same point. There are no extra points for answering a super hard question. So if a question just asks you to combine like terms, you're going to get the exact same point for that question as a question that asks you to find the determinant of a matrix. You're going to get the exact same point, and combining like terms is way easier. So we want to make sure that we answer those easier questions first and we get all those points. Should you use your calculator on every question? No, there will definitely be questions that you don't even need your calculator for. But I do want you to note, so if you are doing some math, some mental math, keep it to really basic numbers. So I can add 53 plus 27 in my head. I'm fine doing that, but I would not do that on the ACT. I would plug those numbers into my calculator and see what the answer is and use that number. So I'm not going to do mental math as much for bigger numbers, just because I want to not introduce any opportunity for making a silly mistake. So we really want to be careful with those to not make silly mistakes. Then there's another question. Will the hard questions at the end of the math section take a lot longer to solve? And that's a no. So some of the harder questions can be really fast. They're just testing you, do you know a concept? And it can be a 10-second question, even though it's a harder question. So if you've already taken pre-calc in Algebra 2, so remember the ACT math section tests you on Algebra 1, Algebra 2, geometry, and then there will also be some pre-calc / trig questions. So if you've already taken all of those math subjects and you took pre-calc recently, I would make sure that you're able to get to all the questions on the ACT math section, that you're not spending a ton of time on a word problem when maybe there was a question dealing with the unit circle at the end that you could just answer really quickly. So be careful with managing your time. So let's look here for a second at the math core concepts. I see your question there, Marissa. We'll look at that for sure today. Okay. So the math core concepts, this is in your Google Drive folder. And it's extremely important for you to memorize these. Remember, for ACT math, they don't give you any equations or formulas. They give you nothing. You have to have it memorized. So if you don't have these memorized yet, I would memorize it ASAP, because the sooner you start committing this to your memory, it will go into your long-term memory and then be more likely for you to be able to recall, to retrieve that information on test day than if you cram it the night before. So this information isn't going anywhere. I'm not going to give you an announcement in a week, hey, I was just kidding, you don't need to know this. You definitely do. So we need to know those different forms of a parabola, right? We need to know the equation of a circle, even though if you're using a TI-84 plus CE or a TI-84 plus, that equation is in your calculator. So I'm just gonna make here, so, or go to Connects app. But if you don't understand that HK is the center of a circle, even going to the Connects app isn't going to help you a ton, right? So knowing those equations is something that I still want you to focus on. knowing these equations for a line, y equals mx plus b, ax plus bx equals c, y minus y1 equals m times x minus x1. Extremely important for the ACT. Knowing the y-intercept, x-intercept, and then the slope formula, you are pretty much guaranteed to get at least one question, maybe even two, in the math section about the slope. So if you don't already know that, really get on the slope formula and commit it to memory. Area of the sector and arc length, also really important, likely to be on there. The quadratic formula, you should know it, but you could use your calculator to solve most quadratic formula questions. Something though to note with the quadratic formula is that you really want to know the discriminant. So the discriminant is what's under the radical, and it tells you how many solutions you're going to have. So if b squared minus 4ac is positive, you get 2 real solutions. If it is negative, you get no real solutions. And if it is 0, you get 1 real solution. A question is really unlikely to ask you, hey, what is the discriminant? That would just not be true to ACT form, but a question may ask you, for what numbers do you get 2 real solutions or 1 real solution? And that would be code for, hey, you need to use the discriminant. Then these exponent rules are also not going anywhere. You really need to memorize them. Logs, you may get an ACT where you don't even need to know the log rules, but they do appear on every couple of ACTs. So it's something where you don't want to lose those points just because you don't know them. But if you're prioritizing the order that you're memorizing this information with, I would probably put the log rules towards the bottom, especially because you can use your calculator to back solve a lot of log questions. Then of course, all the shapes, you need to know those volume equations, sequences, you need to know those formulas. But let's look at some actual questions today. Remember, my ACT Bootcamp video is on YouTube, and I go through each of these during that bootcamp. But for the workshops, I want to spend more time looking at actual questions. Okay, I'm going to pull up this key for the sake of speed, so that I can get through more questions in a shorter amount of time so that you can see what is important and what clues can you use when answering the questions. And for this, I'm actually going to pull up my graphing calculator next to the key so you can see both. So I'm just going to prepare that really quickly here. That's going to make it faster, so I'm not opening up the calculator and then closing it and going back and forth. So just give me 1 second while I pull this up. We're going to do some math rapid review for these questions. Ooh, and then before I pull this up, let me just make note of the questions we need to go over specifically. And I am just going to put that on my phone here so that I have it handy. Oops. Okay, so we need to look at 37 for sure. 40. See if other ones. So 37 and 40, and then I saw another one here in the chat. 56. And then I will also pick out some other questions. Okay, so I have, just gonna minimize some things here. Close that, get this calculator ready. And yay, now I can do this. Share my screen. There we go. Okay, here we go. Let's look, I'm just gonna zoom in here at some of the first questions. So when you look at the math core concepts, you will note that I have a little timing tip at the top right corner that you want to answer the first 30 questions in 20 minutes. So you don't want to spend a ton of time on the first set of questions. You want to be able to answer them super quickly, which means that you need to be able to recognize what concept does the question want you to use. There's not really time on ACT math to try to figure it out. If it doesn't come to you immediately what you should be doing, it's probably a good question to skip and come back to, because most of the questions, it will be pretty clear whatever you need to do. So here in question number 1, they give you 3 eggs make 6 servings and 5 eggs will make how many servings? We don't know. And then they give you that little clue here, proportionally, which tells us we want to set up a proportion. So you will notice when you look at my answer keys that I show a lot of work. And this is something I would do even if I wasn't preparing a key for you guys to look at. Because the more you write down on your piece of paper, the less likely you are to make a silly mistake. So we want to make sure that we're putting eggs over servings. So I would write that down just like I did here. So we have 3 over 6 equals 5 over x. X is what we're finding. Then we can just cross multiply the 3 and x here, and then the 6 and 5, and it gives us 3x equals 30, x equals 10. I didn't have to use my calculator to answer this question at all, but you could use Numeric Solver if you were feeling not the best about this one. So I'd go math, up 1, Numeric Solver, and you could just put in 3 over 6, and then 5 over x, press enter, then graph to solve it, and it gives me x equals 10, which is answer choice C. So you could use it, but you don't have to. Number 2 here. So there's a 35-member history club, so we know that's our total is 35, and they're choosing a student government representative. The members decide that the representative who will be chosen at random cannot be any of the 3 officers of the club. So we have to subtract that 3 from our total in the denominator, and we're only choosing 1 representative, right? Hiroko. So Hiroko goes in the numerator, that's just 1. So we have 1 over 35 minus 3, so 1 over 32. Again, we don't have to use the calculator to answer that, but we could put 1 over 35 minus 3 in the calculator if you wanted to. Let's just do that, see what it gives us. 35 minus 3 gives us a decimal. All of my answer choices are fractions there. So we just go math, frac, and it gives me my answer in fraction form. Number 3 here, for what value of x is the equation 2x plus 7 equals 2 to the 15th power true? So you should know that whenever you have exponents that are variables, you want the bases to be the same so that you can set those exponents equal to each other. In this case, we already have the same bases, so we don't have to do that work. We could also use equation solver for this, although I don't really like teaching students to do this. I do want you to know you have it in your back pocket. So I could go math, then up 1 to numeric solver, equation solver, same thing, and go 2 to the 2x plus 7, and then press enter, and then that equals 2 to the 15th, press enter, and then to solve it, we press the graph button, and it gives us 3.999, which I can round to 4. I could also answer this question if I didn't know the algebra, just by plugging in the answer choices for x in the variable. So I could see, hey, what is 2 to the, let's actually store. So I'm gonna just say 2, and then I'm gonna store it as x, and then I'm gonna see what is 2 to the 2x plus 7. And that gives me 2048. And then let's see what 2 to the 15th equals. That's not equal to each other. So now let's store 4 as x. And let's see what 2 to the 2x plus 7 equals. when x equals 4. Ooh, and that does equal 2 to the 15th. So B would be right. So that's a quick way that you could use here to just take advantage of the answer choices and plug those into the original equation. Here we have, let the function f be defined as f of x equals 5x squared minus 7 times 4x plus 3. What is the value of f of 3? So I could just plug in 3 to the equation, and you can see that's what I did here, right? I put 5 times 3 squared minus 7 times 4 times 3 plus 3. But that is a lot of parentheses. Or I could just say, hey, 3, and then store it as x, and then put in that equation. So 5x squared minus 7 times 4x plus 3. And it gives me, my answer is negative 60, which is J. If I didn't want to do it this way, I could also go to y equals and just put in that equation. So 5x squared minus 7 times 4x plus 3. And then I can graph it because they want to know what is the value of f of 3, and that means what is y equal to when x equals 3. So we're going to press your second graph, which takes us to the table, and I'm going to look at what is y when x is 3 and y is negative 60, which is also the answer. So there are 3 ways you can use to answer this question, and it's up to you which way is going to be most efficient. I would probably just graph it and look at the table because I think those are often the fastest way to solve function questions. They're going to insert the least possibility of making a silly mistake. Let's look at number 5 here. So here we have a wallet that has different bills. So 5 $5 bills, 7 $10 bills, 8 $20 bills, and then 1 bill is drawn randomly. So this throws off a lot of students because they want to put 5 times $5, 7 times $10, so $70, 8 times $20, and put $160. But you really need to just think of those dollar bills the way the different denominations, kind of just like different color marbles. Like you have 5 red marbles, 7 blue marbles, 8 yellow marbles, and then work from there. So don't get confused when they're giving you weird information that maybe makes you want to do more work than you need for a problem. So remember, math questions go from easy, medium to hard. So don't overcomplicate the first set of questions. Number 6 here, we have the ABC Book Club charges a $40 monthly fee plus $2 per book. So I immediately see, ooh, this is y equals mx plus b because the $40 monthly fee is my slope, is my y-intercept. That's my starting amount, regardless of how many books you take out. And then $2 per book is my slope. So I would have 40 plus 2x. And then the Easy Book Club would be 35 as my y-intercept plus 3x. And you could solve this by combining your x's and your constants, or you could just use equation solver. Note that if you are solving this for x and you are not using equation solver, I always keep my variable positive. So I would subtract 2x from both sides of the equation and then 35 from both sides of the equation. I would not subtract 3x from both sides of the equation. Let's look here at number 7. In this parallelogram, ABCD, AC is a diagonal. The measure of angle ABC is 40 degrees, and the measure of angle ACB is 57. What is the measure of CAD? Angle CAD. So in this case, you do need to just know that for a parallelogram, B and D, those two angles would be equal. So angle B would equal angle D. Once you have that, you should also know that there's 180 degrees in a triangle. So you can subtract that 40 and 57 to get this little angle A here is D. Let's look at number 8. So here you can see is a really good example of if I plug in 1/2, I have to use a ton of parentheses. That's a lot of work. If I just store, hey, 1/2, and then store it as x, so x equals 1/2, I can do this a lot faster. I can just say, hey, 8x minus 3 over x, and it gives me 2, so my answer is G. This was a 15-second question, if even. So there are definitely questions here where you can get through super fast. Number 9. What is the midpoint of the line segment that has endpoints 3, 8, and 1, -4? So midpoint is on the back page of your core concepts handout. So I will always do the least amount of work possible. So I can see when I look at my answer choices that -12 appears twice as the y value for the midpoint, but all my x values differ. So I can just add up 3 plus 1, which is 4, divide by 2, that gives me +2. So I know I need +2 for my x coordinate of the midpoint, so it has to be D. So I show a lot of work here to show you how to get both sides, but realistically, I would just find the x coordinate of the midpoint. Okay, let's look at some of the questions that were submitted. Let's go on to 37. And then we'll make our way back a little bit. Mr. and Mrs. Smith plan to roof the cabin on 2 consecutive days, assuming that the probability of rain is independent of the day. What is the probability that it will rain on both days? So this is an and question for probability. And on your core concepts handout, you will see on the first page, I say whenever you see and or both, you need to multiply the individual probabilities. A lot of the time when students miss this question, it's because they didn't notice that in this whole information given part, they say here during the week, the Smiths plan to roof the cabin, there is a 20% of rain each day. So we have to convert that percentage to a decimal. So 20% would be 0.2 and multiply it. So we have 0.2 times 0.2, and that gives us 0.04 for both days. Let's look here. Question 40 was another one that was submitted. This is also a core concept. So I have absolute value on there. Let me actually, is this the one? Yeah, well, this is not the ACT one. Yep, this is it. Yeah. Okay. Let me actually show you on here instead of just telling you, hey, this is a core concept. So let's look here. So we are looking at absolute value, which is on the back page here. So for absolute value, you want to isolate the absolute value expression first. And then when you remove those absolute value bars, you're going to set it equal to a positive and a negative. And then you can solve for the variable. Something to note here, and it's true for a lot of ACT math questions, we want to look at those answer choices before we do all the work so that we don't do too much work. So because it's a really fast section, a lot of the time they just kind of want you to set up the questions and they don't actually expect you to solve all the way. So you can kind of get into trouble here if you solve for the variable and then you look at the answer choices and that's not what they wanted. So you want to make sure that you kind of peek and just see, what am I going for here? And then use that as you solve the question. So they give us 2x minus 8, the absolute value of 2x minus 8 plus 3 equals 5 as 2 solutions. Those solutions are equal to the solutions to which of the following pairs of equations. So first, I'm going to isolate that absolute value expression. So we have the absolute value of 2x minus 8 equals 2. Then when I remove these absolute value bars, I have that expression equal to positive 2 and negative 2. So any answer choice not equal to some form of 2, I can eliminate. So I eliminated F, H, and J. And I can see both G and K have that 2x minus 8 equals 2, right? So I know it's going to be one of those, but then when I look at the next row, so negative 2x minus 8 equals 2, doesn't match what I have for my other equation. Negative times 2x minus 8 equals 2 is also not what I have. But then I notice here that what happens if I just multiplied both sides by a negative for my second equation here? I get negative times 2x minus 8 equals 2. So that actually matches K. What could you do here if, yeah, we'll just leave it like that. I'm not going to go into a third way for this one, even though I'm tempted. Let's look at the other question we have here too. I think it's 56. Where is 56? Ooh. So this is kind of a longer question, but we have time for this one today. So at the school carnival, Mike will play a game in which he will toss a penny, a nickel, and a dime at the same time. He will be awarded 3 points for each coin that lands with heads face up. Let the random variable X represent the total number of points awarded on any toss of the coins. What is the expected value of X? So this question takes up a lot of time. It's probably the most time-intensive question on this whole math section, and it is one that I would save until you've answered every single other question. It's also an advanced probability question. So it may be harder for you if you have not taken stats. Doesn't mean you can't learn how to answer a question like this. So let's look at our steps involved here. So first, we need to figure out the probability of him tossing each one. So let's say he tossed 3 heads, right? That means I would have a head, head, and head. Let's say he tossed 2 heads. I could have my 2 heads and then a tail, or I could have a head, tail, head, or I could have a tail and then a head, head. So that's just the order that he's tossing these coins, and I'm getting these different outcomes. I'm getting all my different outcomes over here. If he tossed 1 head, the head could be the first one he tossed, the second one, or it could be the last coin could be the head if he's tossing it 3 times, right? And then 0 heads would just be 3 tails, right? So there's only one way that you can get 0 heads. It would be if he tossed 3 tails. So over here where we have heads, 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 tails, 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 all of those, that is my sample space. So that means it's all my different outcomes, right? So I need to add those up to see what are all my possible outcomes. Remember that first probability question in this section? Let me actually, I'm going to scroll up to it really quickly. This is a similar concept for number 5, but it's just easier to think through. So in the denominator here, we have the total number of bills. These are all the outcomes that are possible when I am pulling out bills. The same thing applies to question 56 over here, that I have different outcomes, right? I could have the head, 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 tail, and I need to account for every single outcome, how I could get those heads. Okay. For the penny, nickel, and dime, that's why we have 3 coins, right? So 3 spots for each one. So I have all my outcomes. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, which is why I put 8 in the denominator here for each of these fractions. So the probability of getting 3 heads is just 1 head, head, head over 8, over all those outcomes that we added up. The probability of getting 2 heads is the heads, heads, tails, heads, tails, heads, tails, heads, heads. So that's 3 ways we could get 2 heads over 8, which is our total number of outcomes. We follow the same process for 1 head and 0 heads. And then we need to multiply those by the points. So remember, he gets 3 points for each coin that lands with heads face up. So if he gets 3 heads, he gets 9 points because he would get 3 points for each of those heads. If he gets 2 heads, that's 6 points. 1 head, that's 3 points. And 0 heads, that's 0 points. So I know it's going to be 9, 6, 3, and 0. And I need to multiply it. Let me see if I can do some kind of annotation here. Let me see, annotate. I'll just go like, no. I'm going to use the screenshot tool just so you can kind of see. Usually for questions on the ACT that deal with sample space and probability of this form, you will just be given a table with the sample space probability already in one column and the points or the value in the second column. And you would use the same process that we use at this step. So we are just multiplying the 1/8 by 9, the 3/8 by 6, the 3/8 by 3, and the 1/8 by 0. And that process will be used on a lot of other harder ACT probability questions. In this case, this question is extremely hard because you actually have to come up with the sample space on your own and set it all up on your own. So it's a pretty unusual ACT question in that form. Once we've multiplied all those, so 1/8 times 9 is 9/8, 3/8 times 6 is 18/8, 3/8 times 3 is 9/8, and 1/8 times 0 is 0. We add that all up, it gives us 36/8. We reduce that fraction to 9/2, which is answer choice H. That's a lot of work, right? I hope it became clear to you as I was solving this question why we would save this one for last until we've answered every single other question. Let's think about if we were guessing on this question. So I see that the number 9, right, appears in 2 answer choices. And what else do I see here? The number 2 appears in 2 answer choices. So this is kind of a funny question. Let me just share this on my iPad so you can see how you could kind of guess through this question without doing all that work. Let's say this was your last one and you just didn't have time to do what I just showed you. And please remember, whenever I show you any guessing strategy, it's just that. It's going to be the best way to guess, but it's not going to be your first way or only way. So I can see here the 2 appears twice. And I can also see here that the 9 appears twice. Answer choice H has 2 things that repeat, so that would be the answer that I would guess for number 56. That also happens to be the right answer. So also keep in mind that sometimes it could be your only option or a good option when you are guessing. Okay, let's see here. So we have a couple minutes left. And I just want to open it up to any questions that you guys may have about ACT math, specifically this section. If there are any questions you would like me to go over. So I did share the solutions to this test with you guys. So you should have already been able to look at those, but I'd be happy to look at some specific questions here. Let's look at 59. And I am going to share this. Okay, so for negative pi over 2 is less than theta is less than pi over 2, the absolute value of sine theta is greater than 1 is true for all and only the values of theta in which of the following sets. So I would plug in those answer choices for theta. Let me actually, I will share my screen because I'm going to go in the calculator and it's going to be easier than if I'm on my iPad. Okay. Let's see here. So we are over here. I'm going to zoom out a little bit. So I am going in the calculator. Don't be intimidated when you see theta or pi for answer choices. So the first thing I need to do here is actually change my calculator setting to radians because I see pi here. So I'm going to go down to radians, make sure my calculator is in radians, and plug in pi over 2, negative pi over 2. I'm also going to go borrow my absolute value bar. So I'm going to press math, go over 1 to absolute value. And then I'm just going to see, hey, what is sine of second pi over 2? And that gives me positive 1. And we want values where the absolute value of sine theta is greater than or equal to 1. And for positive pi over 2, that works. So let's try negative pi over 2. So remember, I just went up there and selected that. Now I'm going to press second delete to insert a negative symbol here so they're not wasting time rewriting everything they gave me. I'm going to press enter. That also gives me positive 1. And then they give me these other options. So I know it can't be B, right? It has to include negative pi over 2 and pi over 2. But what about those values between pi over 2? What about pi over 4? Let's try that. So I'm going to go up here, and we're just going to change this to pi over 4. Because for answer choices C and D, it includes points between those quadrants. So this does require a little bit of knowledge about the unit circle. That right over here, I would have pi over 4, which would be between that negative pi over 2 and pi over 2. So it does require a little bit of knowledge, but you could at least get to the point of knowing it's not going to be B just by plugging this information into your calculator. So when I try sine of pi over 4, I see that's not true. 0.7 is not greater than or equal to 1. So it has to be answer choice A. And this notation means that we are only inputting the values negative pi over 2 and pi over 2. We're not accounting for the values between them. That's what C and D would do. And E, the empty set, means there's no such value. And that's obviously not true because we found a value that worked for. Both pi over 2 and negative pi over 2 worked. So we wouldn't pick E, the empty set. The empty set means there's no such value for which it's true. Did we have any other questions here? So we do have a couple of minutes more. I'm going to look here, see if there are any other questions. If not, we will wrap up for today. I'm happy that we were able to touch on each section of the ACT. It can be easy to really put all of our energy just on one section, right? For me personally, I find for most students, it's going to be the math section can just chew up all of our energy because there are so many concepts to learn. But as you're practicing, make sure that you are giving all sections attention, even the sections that you're really great at. So let's say you take an ACT practice test and you get a 32 on the English section. That doesn't tell me that you don't need to worry about the English section. That tells me that you're capable of getting a 35 or a 36 on the English section. So you want to make sure that you're really refining what you're good at too and boosting that score. So when you're prepping for the ACT, don't let your weakest section just take up all your energy so that you stop improving on sections that you're naturally better at. So I'm not saying don't put in the time for math or science if those happen to be your weakest sections. I'm just saying don't neglect those other sections because we get a composite score for the ACT. So they're going to add up your math, science, English, and reading scores and then divide by 4. So if one section is dragging your composite score down, let's say you need a 29 on the ACT for Bright Futures, you could increase your score by increasing your weakest section but you can also increase that composite by doing better on the sections that you're already better at to begin with. So the English section, I think, is by far the easiest one to go pick up points. If you are studying the grammar handout and my core concepts, and you are taking practice tests and you are scoring them and looking carefully at the questions that you missed and looking at what you could do differently the next time, and you're reviewing them. So you're not just taking a practice test, looking at your answers one time, you're coming back to them periodically. You're becoming really familiar with those questions. You're almost memorizing them. And that helps you to recognize that question type in the future and know what to do. So I always think that the worst thing that could happen is if you see a question and you recognize it. So you remember, I remember that from another practice test, but I don't remember what to do. That's just awful if you see something similar again, but you don't know what to do for it. So make sure that you're really going back and you're reviewing ones that you missed, that you fully understand what to do, so that in the future, if you recognize this is what I need to do here, you also have the tools to answer the question. And it's not just a, uh-oh, I remember that from the practice test that I took, but I don't remember what to do or how to answer it. So definitely make sure that you're going back and practicing and reviewing and so forth. So I don't see any questions here, so we will wrap it up for today. Remember, we don't have a workshop next week. Our next one will be the week after 4th of July. Let me check. It's crazy. I'm going to check my calendar really quickly, because I think it's pretty crazy that 4th of July is already next week. But it's probably just because we're meeting at the beginning of this week that it still feels so far away. Yeah. So 4th of July is about a week and a half away, and we don't have a session on the 30th, but we do have a session on July 7th. Okay. So I don't see any questions still. I'm going to let you guys go. Have a great week. Have a happy holiday in a week and a half. And I will see you guys next time. Bye-bye.